Welcome everyone to the Peace and Democracy Forum. I'm Beth Kosh, the Our Democracy Campaign Coordinator for the Australian Democracy Network, and I'll be helping to facilitate our time together. Today, as we meet to discuss our pursuit of peace and also to discuss those who would see us wage war, we acknowledge that we are meeting on land that has been forcibly taken from First Nations people. The battles were bloody, entire families were massacred. We cannot divorce the ugliness of war from the ugliness of colonisation. They are intrinsically linked. So as we gather to discuss how we might pursue peace, we acknowledge that we too have profited from war, while First Nations communities are still experiencing its impacts. We acknowledge and thank First Nations leaders who might be here today for their continued offering of peace. And lastly, we look to this year and hope that Australians will vote to enshrine a voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people's self-determination. Thank you so much for coming today. Today's event is hosted by the Our Democracy Campaign, which is a nationwide movement of people and organisations who are speaking up for an end to corporate influence in our democracy. Co-hosting today's event are Our Democracy partner organisations, the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, the Uniting Church, and the Australian Democracy Network. Together with other partners across civil society, we are working towards a shared vision, a political system where our elected representatives reflect the values and concerns of our communities, and decision-making is balanced and fair, with people and the planet at the heart of it. We have a great session in store for you today. If you're just joining us, I encourage you to say hi in the chat. Our chat box buddies, Isabella and Ray, will be monitoring the chat for questions and themes coming up from the room. But for those requiring a live transcript, you can turn on closed captions by clicking CC Show Captions, that button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We encourage you to tweet about tonight's event by using the hashtags Peaceful Democracy and Our Democracy, and to follow us on our socials. So to get warmed up using the chat, I'm keen for you all to share one word in the chat that describes Australia's relationship with weapons and war currently. What do you think comes up for you? We're here today because we are in pursuit of peace and want to understand and stop those who profit from Australia being in a heightened state of war. And we're here because we recognise that peace, public health, and other issues that we care about get negotiated through the democratic process. And when that process is not working well, it impacts all of us. Today, we're going to hear from advocates, researchers, journalists, politicians, and policy experts who have been experiencing the pervasive tactics used by harmful industries to influence policy outcomes. But you're also going to hear about the solutions to making democracy work for all of us, not just the powerful few. The Our Democracy Campaign has been working to achieve a suite of reforms to improve integrity and transparency in our democracy. And this year, we have a really big opportunity to push those reforms forward. Currently, the Parliament is considering changes to campaign finance and election laws. And done well, these changes could make our democracy fairer. They could improve the likelihood that decisions will get made in the public interest. But done poorly, they could continue to allow harmful industries to secretly pressure decision makers to put their own profit over people. We won't just solve this with legislation, though. There's also a cultural revolution needed. And I'm just keen to see what people are saying in the chat about the relationship that Australia currently has to war and weapons. Disgusting, unbelievable, US-driven, dangerous, unknown, misguided, offensive, ghastly, complicit, oblivious, unhealthy. You can see lots of really, toxic, unhelpful ways that we would describe our relationship with weapons and war. So there's a real cultural change that's needed as well. More on this later, but suffice to say that if you are keen to level the playing field, make it more likely that our government will pursue peace and change the culture and the relationship that Australians have to weapons and war, you're in the right room. We're going to be asking the panel about their experience taking on the Goliaths of industry, but we also encourage you to jump in the chat and ask questions of our panelists too. While we might not get to every question, our team is certainly going to try. And if we don't get to it tonight, we'll try and find a way to get a response back to you. Tonight's event is being filmed and will be available publicly after the event. So while recording will mainly focus on our panelists, if you don't want to be filmed, we encourage you to turn your video off, but our preference is always to see your wonderful faces. Now I'd love to introduce my co-moderator for tonight, Mark Zirnsak. Mark is the Senior Social Justice Advocate of the Synod of Victoria and Tasmania Uniting Church in Australia, and is also a part of the core team of campaigners driving the Our Democracy campaign. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Beth, and it's great to be joining you in introducing our panellists for tonight. So the first panellist, longtime friend, Dr. Sue Wareham. She's spoken and written widely on peace and disarmament issues and is currently the president of the Medical Association for the Prevention of War and the Secretary for Australians for War Power Reform. She's also a past board member of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, ICAN Australia, which won a Nobel Prize. And Dr. Wareham is a former Canberra GP. Welcome, Sue.
Hello, everybody. Lovely to be here.
Thanks, Sue. And I'd also love to introduce Scott Ludlam. Scott served as an Australian Greens Senator for Western Australia from 2008 to 2017. He now works as a writer, designer, and freelance troublemaker based on unceded Yuin country on the south coast of New South Wales. His first book, Full Circle, was published by Black Ink in May 2021, and we can put a link to that in the chat as well. And he was also a co-author of the Australian Democracy Network's report on confronting state capture. Welcome, Scott.
Hey, everybody. Lovely to see such a great turnout.
Michelle Fahy is an independent freelance journalist who investigates and reports on links between the weapons industry and the Australian government. She's been researching and writing about militarism and the arms industry since 2009. Her work has appeared in Declassified Australia, Consortium News, Arena, Progressive International, and Michael West Media. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. Nice to be here with everybody.
And last but not least, Dr. Alison Broinowski joined the Australian Foreign Service in 1963 and then alternated between living and working as a diplomat in Japan, Burma, the Philippines, South Korea, Jordan, Mexico, and the US, working for the UN in New York. She is the author or editor of 14 books and many articles on Australia's interface with the world, particularly Asia. More recently, she taught and researched international relations at multiple Australian universities and is a board member of both Australians for War Powers Reform and World Beyond War. Welcome, Alison. Great to have you with us. So let's get started. Michelle.
Thank you. You're right. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison.
Okay, go ahead.
Michelle, we'll start with you. You've written widely about the influence of the war machine in Australia's democracy. And in fact, you've been really busy this week working on a big expose and are now able to talk publicly about what you found. By way of introduction, can you give us a picture of the kinds of tactics used by weapon manufacturers in their efforts to influence decision makers?
Yes, sure, love to. Arms industry tactics. What I might do just quickly before that, for people who may not know, is just a couple of big picture facts to give you some sense of the scope. I just want to say that the USA alone spends as much money on its military as the rest of the world combined. So it's currently $1.2 trillion a year, and the world spends 2.4 to 2.5. So half of what is spent on military comes from the US. And the same with weapons sales. The US sells more weapons than the rest of the world combined. I just think that's important context because it doesn't often get said in the context of rising power of China. Also, for all the talk about our sovereign defence industry here, we don't really have one. Even before AUKUS, Australia was a significant customer of the US arms industry. And now with AUKUS, we're locked in for decades more. So the dominance in Australia of the US arms giants, particularly also with British BAE and French Thales, is quite significant. Another factor of importance is that the arms industry is one of the most corrupt on the planet. Transparency International says that undue influence and revolving door are two factors that lay the groundwork for that corruption. So that's the big picture. And now to put into that these tactics of undue influence and revolving door, they're not actually corrupt in themselves, but they're red flags for corruption. And that means they require scrutiny and tight management, which basically just does not happen in Australia. So both those things, revolving door and undue influence, pass unremarked. These are the two things that are at the centre of that big expose that Beth mentioned that I just finished on the warships, the frigates. You can read those in the chat. There's going to be a link. The revolving door is a dominant strategy of the arms industry globally. It's a huge way it exerts influence. If you don't know, that's when public officials, politicians, military, intelligence officers, public servants, they leave their defence-related positions and go and work in the arms industry. The revolving part is that the arms industry people also can then come in and work with government. So it's going around. Both of those modes are quite prominent in the example I've just written about that you can see in the chat. The second significant factor is the undue influence that arises with the secret insider status given to arms industry executives inside government, in policy making, on committees, consulting roles. There's hardly any transparency about that, the special industry access. And this is a prominent feature in the frigates story that I just did as well. To put some flesh on that in a quick way, a parallel example, which everyone's going to know about, is PwC. So with the big four, we all know now how those corporate entities can't be trusted with secret inside access. And the same thing exactly happens in defence, except the contracts there are in the billions of dollars, not millions. So that gives you some sense of the scale. So those two tactics, there are a few others, but they're the really big ones, revolving door and undue influence, like inside access.
It's quite shocking. Thanks, Michelle. Really glad that you've been able to do that research. Mark, I'll pass it to you.
Sue, as a long-term advocate and activist around working for peace, can you give us a sense of some of the industry lobbying and tactics that you've witnessed in your time advocating for peace, and perhaps provide some concrete examples?
Yes, thanks, Mark. So the first thing I'll say is that for the arms industry to flourish, it needs wars and it needs threats of wars. And the best wars for the arms industries are those that are long wars, protracted, a stalemate in a place far away. They're the best things for the industry. So that's more or less what they would like to see. I'm going to mention just a few ways in which they go about trying to achieve these things. First one is controlling the media narrative. The narrative needs to be that, from the point of view of the industry, that wars are needed and wars are inevitable. And I'm going to give just one example of this control of the narrative. It is from the United States. It's from the Quincy, QUI and CY Institute in the United States, a report that came out just last month. And there might be a link to this report, which somebody might pop in the chat. But anyway, the report stated that in relation to the Ukraine war and US military involvement in it, media outlets in the United States quoted think tanks with financial backing from the defence industry 85% of the time. So that's the vast majority of the media reports on the Ukraine war in the US were from vested interests, which is pretty shocking. And in addition, those vested interests are rarely identified. In Australia, we have the same problem. I'm not saying it's to the same extent, it may or may not be, but the worst culprit here is ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is extremely influential with government. It's very hawkish on China, and it receives funding from the weapons industry and other sources, in the meanwhile calling themselves independent. So that's the first thing, controlling the narrative. Second thing I'll mention is normalising the industry. So we need to be convinced that spending vast amounts of national treasure, which we can't afford, on wars which will be catastrophic, we need to be convinced that that's an entirely rational and normal thing for us to be doing. So the industry gets its brand name into well-respected institutions, including schools, and MAPW has done a report called Minors, MINORS, and missiles on this particular issue. They get their name associated with charities. There's another example I could mention there later on. And particularly they get their names into the Australian War Memorial, which of course does a few things. It buys respectability and it buys political access for a very small sum of money, I might say. The third thing I'll mention that the industry does is to hide the purpose of their product. They never talk about what their products actually do if they're used as intended. It's never mentioned. Instead, and this is the fourth point, the emphasis is all on glamour and prestige. They talk about exciting careers, cutting edge technology, and all the rest of it. And if you actually look on the website of any of the big global weapons companies and have a look for the word weapons or arms or something like that, and it's very, very hard to find. They just don't talk about weaponry. And the last thing I mentioned is that they talk up the issue of jobs. It's all about jobs, when in fact, if we put the same amount of investment into other sectors of our society, then we'd get far more jobs, and we'd get jobs across a much broader set of skills and pay ranges. So they're just some of the tactics. One could expand a lot on those, but I think I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sue. And Scott, you've had a pretty unique insight on this as one of the decision makers that these lobby groups have sought to influence. Can you tell us a bit about what it's like being courted by all these industry groups, and what does their persuasion feel like? What are some examples of the tactics that they've used on you?
I'm a terrible example of this. I've probably got less experience in this stuff than a lot of other people who work in that building, because prior to being elected, I was an anti-war campaigner. I'd spent, as many other folk on this call, I suspect, spent a couple of years trying to stop the invasion of Iraq and organize demonstrations against the occupation of Afghanistan. And so I think by the time I got in there, the arms lobbyists knew very well there was no point knocking on my door. So I don't have any direct insights. Obviously the lobbying presence is intense. A lot of this direct interface happens at things like the Avalon Air Show, which I've never been, or other of these kind of arms fair events where they're behaving as though they're just a regular industry group and you can go and see their shiny toys. But of course, that's one of the kind of main interfaces where these personal relationships are developed. It's absolutely pervasive, but I suspect I was one of the people who was left out because they simply knew that anybody who's going to be on the floor of the Senate arguing against increased military spending and against the next reckless intervention in some war somewhere would be the last person they'd want to lobby. I don't know if it's appropriate to do it, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's an ADN event. If people want to get a sense of just how saturated that environment is, though, and how these relationships are built inside and outside of Parliament House, Michelle, myself, Felicity Ruby, and a couple of others produced this report for the Australian Democracy Network a couple of years ago on the subject of state capture. And so maybe it's just worth at this point, it's not just about the lobbying, it's not just about the donations, which we're going to cover in a little bit. It's this kind of saturation relationship building, which kind of fuses the industry tier of arms industry lobbyists and manufacturers and the political tier, where it becomes very difficult to tell the difference between the two. And I think Michelle was going to talk in a little bit about the arms industry case study that's in there. But for people on the call to not imagine that there's this deep separation between the state and the arms industry lobbyists, it becomes difficult to distinguish between the two, and that's why this problem is so difficult to untangle. There's a link in the chat there to that study.
Thanks so much, Scott. Mark?
Alison, you were formerly a diplomat and subsequently have gone on to become part of Australians for War Powers Reform. Can you tell us a bit about how you saw Australia's foreign policy relate to war, and why has Australia been unable to democratise the way it goes to war as other countries have done?
Thank you. Happy to do that for you, Mark. I have to say that what I want to concentrate on tonight, apart from everything else that everyone has said that is so valuable, is to question the whole idea about a democracy network. Quite frankly, the label is trashed. It's trashed because our democratically elected politicians totally ignore Australian opinion and continue to do so. Occasionally we change governments, but really when we do, a lot of Australian opinion is still ignored. For instance, not only on how we go to war, which is of course my main concern and those of my colleagues in AWPR, but also why we continue to open up new coal mines, why we continue to approve or not object to the use of cluster bombs. Why do we not do anything serious about climate change? These are things about which Australians are concerned, and yet our democratically elected representatives don't take them as issues to where they should in the parliament. There has been, as you all know, no report on how we went to war in Iraq. That is something that people in AWR continue to be concerned about. There has been no democratic process about that. And we could do it again. We could do another war with no democratic process of any kind. So in fact, democracy, which is what we all like to think we believe in, is very close to militarism. Let's face it. It's not about peace. It's not about equality. It's about doing the things that our allies want to do by force. It's about surveillance, suppression. I mean, look at the way climate protesters have been vigilated in our legal process simply because they want to protest about what is being done on climate in Australia. It's not a matter of just democracy either. It's the disproportionate influence of media conglomerates, as we all know. Freedom of information is being thwarted by governments, whistleblowers are arrested, and the whole idea of a state, a relationship between the people and state and corporate propaganda has been totally trashed. So, in fact, we have to ask ourselves, what does democracy really mean in Australia now? Is it accountability to the people, or is it just obeisance to the think tanks, as has been mentioned, like ASPI and so on? The fact that we don't have a Bill of Rights, the only country in the OECD that does not. I mean, how can we talk about democracy and hope that that affects peace when we don't have democracy in the first place? Can I leave it there and people can dispute if they wish? Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Alison. And yeah, I think that that's why we're here, right? We want to improve democracy so that we can actually get towards peace. Like they are so interconnected, and we cannot have one without the other. So that's why I think so many of us are here, because we want to try and strengthen our democracy. And all the things that you mentioned about the fact that we don't have good whistleblower protection, the fact that we don't have the fact that we can see war powers not being properly held up like they should be in other global examples. Yeah, there's a lot that we can work on. So thank you so much, Alison. I'm now going to throw back to you, Michelle. Michelle, in your research on the influence of weapons companies in Australia, can you tell us about how easy or hard it is to get information on the access and influence of these big companies on our politicians? What is currently transparent and what's hidden? I'm keen to know how hard it is as a journalist to find the information you're looking for on these powerful industries.
Thanks, Beth. Well, I'll start with what's transparent and easy, because that won't take long. We can find out the name. For example, if I want to know the names of directors of weapons companies, that's done quite easily, because that needs to be made transparent. So websites, annual reports, Australian Securities and Investment Commission. So it's easy to find out who the directors are of companies in Australia. It's also easy for me as a journo for free, but the public can do this as well and pay, not too much. You can lodge a form with ASIC and ask, say, Christopher Pine, let's just pick on him, and say, tell me which companies he's a director of, and you can get a big list of those. So that kind of information, basic step one information, is easily done. Basically, for what I do, and it is a bit different from what other journos do, because I'm quite forensic about it, after that it starts getting a lot more difficult. Basically, you need to know where to go and look and how to dig around for things. The one thing I wanted to talk about here, because I could say a lot and take a long time, but I'll just talk about a couple of examples. With the big multinationals, their subsidiaries here, they don't need to have a board because they're all offshore. So what they tend to do to have influence is have advisory boards. That's very difficult to find out very often. There's not much transparency about who's on their advisory boards, but they wield a fair amount of influence. I'll give you an example of what that is. A different story I did a few years ago, which maybe quite a few people will know about, is the Thales Hawkeye armoured vehicle. And with that one, we found out that the former Liberal Defence Minister, Brendan Nelson, while he was employed by the Commonwealth as the director of the War Memorial, took a secret position on the Thales advisory board at the same time that Thales was in the final months of trying to nail down the contract on the Hawkeye. So that's quite a disturb. That was done secretly. So the Hawkeye's been controversial for years. It started way back in 2006. It's 17 years and they're still not going. And in fact, it was in the news last week or recently because Ukraine want them and we can't send them because the brakes are faulty. So it's just been a debacle. Anyway, it hit the headlines. The Audit Office, which I love the Audit Office, big plug for the Australian National Audit Office, did a report a few years ago, which concluded that that vehicle wasn't good value for money. And Christian Porter, who was the Attorney General at the time, was very heavily lobbied by Thales to suppress the report. And he did, Christian Porter did, and he censored it. But the thing I wanted to draw out here, which I talked briefly about in the state capture, but this secret advisory board that was going on in the background, which is, we had no clue about Brendan Nelson being on that. And it only just came out by accident So it had Brendan Nelson and Stephen Loosley, who was a former Labor senator. So it looks very much like a lobbying advisory board, really, doesn't it? That's what it sounds like to me. And 5 months after they got Brendan Nelson to join it, the Libs were then in power. The Hawkeye deal is mysteriously signed. Now, I don't know whether Brendan Nelson did that or not, but the timing's pretty interesting. And also interesting was that the Commonwealth government, then the coalition government, let Brendan Nelson moonlight as a Tully's advisor while he's also the director of the War Memorial at the same time as that deal's getting pushed through. And I just sort of asked the question of how can that be okay? And he actually needed to get permission from the minister to do that, and he was given it. So there's a lot of murkiness and questions around that. The thing to highlight is information like that is not transparent. So I'll tell you how it came out and then I'll finish up because I might be on the time limit here. But the only way that came out was because you might remember back then that I think it was Scott Morrison, they put in a new foreign influence transparency arrangement. And the idea of it was to flush out all this Chinese influence in Australia. But actually Brendan Nelson was the first, the first person they flushed out because Tully's, of course, being a French company and he was working for them. So, so sometimes it's just a good example of how things just fall out of the sky. And then I was already looking at that deal and you can join up a whole bunch of dots and that's how it comes out. But, you know, it's quite difficult. And that's a good example of ways in which it can be difficult and you can be lucky or you don't find out anything.
Yeah, it sounds like you can often draw a lot of correlation, but it's very hard to say. And therefore, this person made this decision as a result of that lobbying influence.
Yes, you can't. Exactly right. But, you know, there's lots of things in between. And now that I've been doing it for quite a few years, there's things I remember from before. So you can see a dot here and go, oh, that's interesting about that. So it takes a lot of time and reading, really, but it's not very transparent at all. Yeah. And the revolving door appointments that you talked about, they can be often tricky to track because people don't update their LinkedIn, for example, and intentionally so, and things like that. So what can be done about that? And I know that you've got a new project coming up to help solve that. Oh, yes, I would like to talk about that. I'm very excited about this and I'm still beaming. And I hope there are some people here listening. When I started this work, my key goal was to be able to do a database of revolving door appointments because they have such a database in the USA, a very good one, and also in the United Kingdom. And so I've been recently successful in having a grant from the New South Wales Quakers. So because it takes so much research, I just couldn't afford to do it without some sort of funding. So very, very happily, New South Wales Quakers Yarn to Vogue Peace Fund has supported this work, and I'll be now starting to work on compiling a database of revolving door appointments because it isn't publicly available. I think it's something that journalists and the public need, so we have no clue about how extensive it is. You get the Christopher Pines and Brendan Nelsons and Kim Beazleys, but it's way more than politicians. There's an extremely large number of military, ex-public servants, intelligence. So I'll be compiling all that. I'll just say quickly, my email address is on my Twitter, and I think Beth is putting our Twitter addresses. So please, if you know anything, don't assume I know it because it's a vast area and I probably don't know it. And feel free to email me. Great, thanks so much, Michelle. Mark.
Scott, I'm keen to raise the issue of political donations. Nobody's denying that for parties to run for elections, they need some level of funding to make that happen. But I guess I'd be keen to hear from you, from your experience, how do these industries use political donations to influence government decision-making?
Well, Mark, I'm very glad you asked. I think it's great to talk a bit about the influence of money on politics, but also to notice that the donations tier is really just the tip of the iceberg, and it's really worth talking about. But I want us to look at the whole iceberg, the influence of money in politics, which is probably intrinsic to living in a capitalist society, where things are so unequal across so many different dimensions. And I reckon Michelle might want to chip in on this one as well. Not to go on about it, but it is an ADN report, so I'm just going to keep highlighting it. In that state capture study that we did a year and a half or so ago, we looked at the role of money in politics, and we drew very heavily on this fellow, Thomas Ferguson. And I've just thrown a link in directly to his research. So he looks at the US, which I think is further down the path toward being a full oligarchy than we are here in Australia. We do still have some checks and balances and some levers, as some of the other speakers have mentioned. He talks about this thing, him and his team, called the investment theory of party competition, which looks at the correlation between the amount of money that candidates spend in the US versus the win-loss ratio. And what they find, very simply and crudely put, is the more money you spend, the more likely you are to win, such that if you know in advance in a US congressional election who spent the most money, if you know in advance, you can predict almost with certainty who won. You don't even need to go out and vote, which is terrifying when you think about it, that whoever spends the most money wins is not what we would normally consider to be a democracy. And in Australia, the data is not as fine-grained as it is in the United States. But in 6 out of the last 6 federal elections, the party that spent the most money won the most seats and was able to form government. There's one kink in that, which is 2010, where Gillard was outspent, but managed to claw her way into minority government because of the crossbench. But as a general rule, if we accept that idea that whoever spends the most money wins, then we're starting to lose track of whether or not we live in a democracy. Which brings us to the role of donations. It's a huge problem, and we should do whatever we can to squash it. But I actually don't think it's the most important thing. In states like Western Australia, for example, where they've really clamped down on donations, the gas industry still runs that state. The arms industry isn't a huge donor, and this might surprise people. Hotel, alcohol lobby, gambling lobby, banks, fossil fuel companies, the resources sector more generally are quite big spenders. But when you look at the numbers that get released every February, firstly, you realize politicians are very, very cheap dates. Like, these are relatively small amounts of money, considering the revenues that come back into these corporations or the subsidies that come back. It's 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 to 1 in terms of the money that they spend. So it's, sorry for being so circuitous about it. I think we should really heavily clamp down on donations reform and make it very difficult for these interest groups to simply buy their way into Parliament. But we also need to be aware of the fact that it's not the only game in town. Where the arms industry is concerned, that revolving door thing, to me, feels more pernicious. That you do your term or your 2 terms in politics, and then you graduate to be on some advisory board for one of these weapons companies. If anything, it's longer term than just chasing a check that was exchanged, or a membership to one of these quasi-invisible business forums that these people buy their way into. It feels like I would, if I only had one pick, I'd rather smash that and try and break that nexus. Anyway, we could do an entire forum just on this. I'm saying the role of money is intrinsic under capitalism. It's extremely important to tilting the playing field, but we've got to keep our eyes on that wider field.
Thanks, Scott. And your point about being able to win elections by spending, Julia Cage, a French economist, has done a work that draws a similar conclusion in Europe as well. Over to you, Beth.
Notice that the campaign finance laws in France are completely different to here or the United States, but the relationship still holds firm.
Yeah. Now, Sue, so often these harmful industries are vying for the right to frame the story, like you were talking about with the narrative before. What narrative from weapons manufacturers have you seen being perpetuated through Australian culture, and what can be done about it?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. And certainly framing the narrative is extremely important for the weapons industry. And I touched on this previously, but basically, unless we, the people, believe that wars are inevitable, then the the business model of the weapons industry is threatened. So they really put forward a very, very simplistic notion. It's always black and white. Any war is black and white, good versus evil. There's no room for grey. Therefore, there's no room for negotiation. And therefore, all the industry and the governments that they're complicit with, as long as they put forward the narrative that there's an enemy, then they can tell us, well, we have no choice. You know, those famous words, we have no choice but to arm ourselves to the teeth, when of course we do have a choice. And it's a bit like the sort of equivalent narrative that children might have. You know, it's goodies versus baddies, and there's nothing in between. And because the baddies are bad, we have to eliminate them by violent action. And it's as bad as that, really. Just one sort of illustration of this, again from the United States, is the importance of the narrative is underlined by the extent to which the Pentagon exerts control over what comes out of Hollywood, not in all respects, of course, but significantly, and the way that Western publics are sort of softened up for aggressive militarism by what we see that comes out of Hollywood, and the Pentagon's influence, even to the extent of demanding changes to scripts, etc., influence over American film and TV, etc. There is a link there which might go in the chat of a study by Jonathan Cook, a report from Jonathan Cook. But in Australia, the narrative, I'm going to come back to the example of the Australian War Memorial, because this is, I mean, you would think that this is preeminently the place where we don't want commercialism coming in, and where we simply want commemoration, and we want some honesty there, and all of those things which are really of no interest to the industry. So yes, in the fact that the War Memorial for some time has accepted donations from the weapons industry, and as I mentioned earlier, they're not big donations, they're tiny bits of pocket money for the industry. They're very, very small in relation to the War Memorial's budget overall. So it's really not about the money, it's about the benefits that the industry gets at the memorial, and those benefits have been stated explicitly, that the companies can get brand name recognition, they get their names up in the memorial, they can get media acknowledgement, and they can get special access to War Memorial events. And, you know, when you've got special access to important events at the War Memorial, that means political access and extra opportunity for political influence. And it's just plain wrong, offensive to have the War Memorial tainted by the industries that profit when civilians and military personnel are dying in wars. So that's all part of the narrative. I'll just, I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, but MAPW has started up a website, Reclaim Remembrance, which has the goal of getting the weapons companies out of our War Memorial. And the particular target at the moment is Lockheed Martin. And Lockheed Martin is the biggest weapons company in the world. And they have helped pay for some of the World War I commemoration at the memorial. And by the way, Australia spent more on our World War I commemoration than any other nation on the planet, even countries that had far, far greater losses than we did. Yeah, I'd encourage you to have a look at Reclaim Remembrance, and there's some action there. There's some more information about Lockheed Martin and some actions there. We've had some other little success in the past with the War Memorial, but maybe I might come back to that later.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. And Scott, do you want to say what you said in the chat? I really resonated with that. I'm sure others might.
I'm trying to remember how old I would have been, maybe 5 or 6 years old, visited Canberra for the first time as a child, and my folks took me to the War Memorial, and I had the strongest memories of those World War I dioramas that just burned into my childish brain, that war is mud and misery and horror. And I feel to this day that's an appropriate role for a war memorial. And since then, it's just become this forum for advertising. It's horrific what they've done to it. So I encourage people to follow that link that Ophelia just threw into the chat. It's a great campaign, and I think most people resonate with it. It had really good resonance, at least in Canberra. So I think that's a great one to run on.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Scott.
Companies advertising at the War Memorial is horrifying to most people.
Mm.
Could I just add a comment? And Scott, thanks for talking about your childhood experience. I'll actually have an article coming out in the next few days about the War Memorial and children, and how do they actually educate children about war. And I cited an example from some years ago where on the website, in their children's activities, they had an activity on dam busting. And it was related to the raids on German dams in 1943. But the activity for the children, and I'm quoting this word for word, see if you can bust the dam. So it was actually inviting children to see if they could work out how you would bust a dam. That is a war crime. Now, I'm not stating that they're doing that right now, but there's a huge campaign which to be had in making sure that in the new War Memorial, the education of children is appropriate and is not propaganda about war.
Yeah, we're seeing trends of some of these harmful industries starting with children in trying to infiltrate the narrative that is being taught to children in education departments. We're seeing that with the mining sector as well. And I know that MAPWA has a campaign around trying to change the education department as well, to make sure that the weapons industry has no place in our education department. Thanks, Sue. Mark, I'll hand over to you.
Alison, recognising time's moving on, but a really important issue is if you can talk to us about the AUKUS deal and who's standing to benefit from it and what your concerns about the AUKUS deal might be.
Thanks, Mark. Quite frankly, I can't see any benefits from the AUKUS deal at all. The only benefit would be if the Prime Minister would reverse his 24-hour decision and cancel the whole thing. The fact that we can't afford decent healthcare, schooling, social services, and the rest, because we're spending huge amounts of money for ways to attack our neighbours in ways that won't even affect them, let's face it, because they're so late, so ineffectual, and so hugely expensive and ridiculous, is just something that I cannot describe in any other way than totally ridiculous. And I think that a lot of Australians, when I was talking earlier about democracy, I think that many Australians have got this and understand it, and yet their views are not getting through to where it counts. They're not getting through the media wall, which is all pro-war. They're not getting through the political war, which is all pro-staying in power, you know. And here we are, putting ourselves in this absolutely absurd position, when what we should really be doing, in my view, is saying to the United States, okay, you haven't got enough ships. To the Brits, you haven't got any. We don't want them anyway. And after all, what are 8 going to do for us at huge amounts of money? To do what? To do what? To attack our major trading partner. I mean, as Utopia said, why are we defending the sea lanes when that is the main way in which we do trade with China. It is so absurd. I just cannot find words to describe the ridiculousness of it. And all I can hope is, in your spirit, in this group's spirit of democracy, that somehow that opinion from the people reaches our politicians who make these decisions in a democratic fashion and changes their minds. Quite frankly, I'm not optimistic. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Alison. And, you know, these problems are really quite pervasive. They're really tricky, they're thick, and we're seeing them across many different sectors. And because they are so challenging, sometimes we can be tempted to give up, but that's what they would want us to do, right? They would be rubbing their hands together if we were like, this is too hard, and put in the too hard basket. So that is why we need to also have solutions, and we need to be coming together and creating a powerful block together to advocate for those solutions. So Mark, I'm keen for you to take us through what the Our Democracy campaign has been working on with other civil society organisations to create those solutions, and what is the framework for a fair democracy trying to do, and how will it address state capture?
Thanks, Beth. So it doesn't have to be like this. The group of 30 civil society organisations came together and developed the framework for a fair democracy. So the framework's built on 3 broad pillars here. So one is to stamp out corruption, and we've already seen a strong Federal Integrity Commission implemented and just started this week. The other parts of that is to have an enforceable code of conduct for ministers and their advisors, strong institutions, merit-based appointments under this, so that we don't have political decisions being made to reward political allies or former colleagues with plum positions, but in actual fact, those positions go to people based on their merits. There's a second pillar, which is about ending cash for access. So this particularly tries to address the issue of corporations, whether they be arms industry or other harmful industries, being able to buy their way in to have more access into our political system, and therefore unduly shape our public policy. So that includes transparency about who's making donations, large ban on large donations, reforms on lobbying, so a lobbying registers that actually work. There's been some research done around lobbying registers that find that across the country, the different lobbying registers at state and federal level, the lobbyists can put in different information on the different lobby registers. So they're not very well policed at this stage, and addressing that issue of the revolving door, which is one of the things that we're required to do under the UN Convention Against Corruption, which Australia is a signatory to. And then the final pillar is level the playing field. So basically capping political expenditure. So if parties and candidates are capped in how much they can spend on an election, it gives them less need to pursue donations and to seek to get private donations from donors, and then be, in a sense, owing those donors favours in return, and also a move towards truth in political advertising laws. And we've seen some move towards that with the federal government at the moment doing a consultation around a piece of legislation looking at disinformation and misinformation, but this would go further and look at trying to restrain inappropriate and untruthful political advertising. We've already seen a model of that introduced in South Australia. We've already had a parliamentary inquiry that handed down its findings just recently. So some of those reforms are already now on the agenda, and where the current government, as outlined here, so secret political donations should be banned. There's a need to limit how much anyone can spend on political donations. Sensible spending caps is there. The one we are concerned about, though, that the committee has recommended that there be limits on or that donations to civil society organisations should be more regulated. That's going to be problematic for a whole bunch of civil society organisations in the sheer administration burden that gives. You've also got the problem of when a civil society organisation accepts a donation, sorting out whether it can be used for political expenditure or not. It can become difficult. And the other thing that makes that somewhat unfair is that a lot of for the big corporates who donate into the political system, they don't have to rely on donations to raise their funds. So targeting that disproportionately affects civil society organisations. There is also some question marks. We certainly favour the notion that democracy works best when there is an ability for challenges to give voters different alternatives to consider within the system. So new laws need to make sure that people can reasonably challenge a sitting member and not give unfair weighting towards the existing sitting members. And the Parliamentary Committee also recommended that politicians not be able to lie within their advertising as such. But we need to go further. Addressing campaign finance is critical, but we also need to regulate the whole lobbying system, which I think is something that a number of our speakers raised tonight. And as part of that, the Our Democracy movement is looking to put up its own fair play bill, a civil society solution to the problem of big money dominating our democracy. These reforms have been put together through deep consultation with experts and community groups and political stakeholders. The Fair Play Bill proposes a gold standard of reforms that will give us fairer elections and more equity in political influence. So policies outcomes can best represent the community's interests and the public interest, rather than being captured by large corporates or wealthy individuals unduly using their money to influence our democracy.
That's great. Thank you so much, Mark. There's a lot in there, a lot of policy detail. We're going to share some links in the chat about how you can find out more about what those reforms are. But really what we're trying to address is the problems we've been talking about tonight. So in levelling the playing field, in stopping corruption, in ending that cash for access, that's what we're trying to address. So we're keen to hear from you now. I know that many of the audience likely has a million questions from our panelists about their research, their experience, their policy solutions. Isabella, what questions have been coming up for our panelists?
Hi everyone, thanks Beth, and thanks to all the panel. You have got the chat popping. So many great questions. I am going to try and prioritise those that are about peace and the war industry. And if we get time, we'll get into some of the more systemic democracy questions. It's all kind of things coming through. I wanted to start by raising several, there's been several great questions about building a movement for peace. Jane Manning mentioned being shocked by the lack of peace consciousness and awarenesses compared to, say, environmental activism. And we're wondering if any of the panelists have thoughts about this and how we can grow a movement for peace.
What a great question. Sue, we might throw to you first to have a go at answering this.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. And yes, it is absolutely critical because Australia is basically sleepwalking towards a major, absolutely catastrophic war against China, which could turn out to be a nuclear war. So it is absolutely critical that this is addressed in a huge way. I would just add that in the wake of the AUKUS decision, I think there has been some really good activism going on, and the dissent within Labor, even though this is not a grassroots across the country movement, but the dissent within Labor is extremely encouraging, and particularly encouraging is the activism that we're seeing in the Port Kembla. Down near Wollongong, where a lot of people turned out on May Day for a rally against AUKUS, against war, and basically pro-peace. So I was really, really encouraged by that. So I think there's a lot to build on there. I think the union movement is doing great stuff in that respect. Just one thing one way in which I think we can make a link between the climate movement and the peace movement, such as it is, and it's a fairly, well, I think to a lot of us it's fairly obvious, but it really needs stating that one of the worst things that could happen for our climate would be another major catastrophic war. Once nations are at war, then everything else is deprioritized. Who cares about climate change when you're trying to fight a war? So I think that lack of focus and lack of funding, which is already accompanying the sort of path to war, but would be far worse if we were actually in a war with China. So I think we can point to that link, that war with China would be an absolute disaster for the climate, as well as for a host of other reasons. And I think that may be one way of getting a lot more of the climate activists also active in the peace space, because, these are really basically one and the same struggle for a livable planet. So I think we need to draw on the energy and the wisdom that is there in the climate movement and bring some of that into the peace movement as well.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sue. Other panelists, do you have other thoughts about how we might build a peace movement? Maybe have one more contribution and then move on to the next question.
Well, we've done it before, and there's a reason that there's no more atmospheric nuclear weapons testing, and that's because people around the world stood up and stopped it. And although we weren't successful in the case of Iraq, which I think really bruised and damaged the peace movement globally, and that, we just need to take account. I think somebody did put in the chat the kind of age profile of all of us here tonight. I think in part is a consequence of that, is that we need to work with the new and emerging voices coming through. And I'm, similar to Sue, seeing the amount of people turning out in Port Kembla, that kind of the grassroots uprising, where we're not talking about treaties or legislation or even necessarily a kind of detailed reform package. It's more, we don't want nuclear submarine pens just down the road from where we live. And that is how movements are built. So I just think working with the energy that's there, the emerging energy it's there, and also just acknowledging and paying our respects to the people who have done the hard yards in this. There's folk on this call who've been doing this work for 30 or 40 years. And just, acknowledging that strength and the depth of the movement and linking that together with the emerging folk who are coming through. The folk who are busting up and disrupting arms fairs, people who are doing walk-ons every time we get one of those talisman saber exercises, or folk mobilizing around the country. We absolutely can do it. And, we may not have a huge amount of structure at the grassroots level yet. That'll come in time. We've got former prime ministers getting on TV, absolutely shit-canning this whole AUKUS idea, and just speaking some truths from remarkable, unusual places and unusual directions. We've got allies in the trade union movement, in local government right around the country. It takes time, but I do believe that we can do it. The whole AUKUS debacle has offended a lot of people, including, I think, in some unusual, we'll have some unusual allies, I think, in days to come.
Yeah, great, Scott. Inspiring. Thank you. Izza, what's our next question?
Yeah, I might jump off where Scott ended there. There were also a couple of questions about AUKUS, and one in particular, whether there is a realistic path to reversing it, or what people can do right now to try and raise those voices that are opposing AUKUS.
Who'd like to kick us off? Michelle, do you have any thoughts?
I don't know about that specifically. I'm not a huge campaigner, but one thing I wanted to throw in here for people to think about, and maybe it'll generate some ideas as well, is I'm actually quite concerned about a sleeper issue associated with this, which is the nuclear waste dump, which gets hardly any publicity. And I think it's a central part of what's coming and what's going on, but it's really under the radar. And the thing that really concerns me about it is we're in the year of the voice, and it's going to be put on Indigenous land, and their voices are being silenced. And so I really wanted to raise that this evening. So as well as bringing together young climate people and militarism, which I think intimately go together, I think we also need to stand beside Indigenous people who've said loud and clear for decades they don't want nuclear waste on their land. And I think that's a very important issue that isn't getting brought into this. So that will answer your question, but I just did want to add that in as well.
That's great. Thanks, Michelle. And Alison, we'll go to you next, and then we've got Sue.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Beth. I just want to follow up on what Michelle raised, because it is essential. It is at the core of what we're talking about. I have to give a speech in Alice Springs early next month in memory of Yami Lester, who lost his sight as a result of the Emu Plains nuclear tests. And thinking about that and writing that made me realize, I should have realized, but belatedly, made me realize that the people who suffer from all of this are our Indigenous First Nations people more than anybody else. Think, when we've got these nuclear submarines, where is the waste going to be put? Where are the decommissioned boats going to be put? Where is all of it going? It is going to go into some land that is nowhere near any politician's home, but is more likely than anything to be on Indigenous land. Somewhere in the middle of Australia, there will be a huge dump of this stuff. That is, if not even if we don't do what some people are suggesting, that we make Australia into a worldwide depository for nuclear waste, which still has no technology that can separate it from the biosphere for as long as it takes. So these things ought not to be just brushed aside. They are a very important part of our democracy, and the voice of the Indigenous people in that disposal and in those decisions is going to be a really important test of the value of the voice, I suggest.
Yeah, great, Alison. Thanks so much. And Sue, we'll go to you next, but we might need to have a very short response because we only have time for one more question after this, surprisingly.
Okay, all right, thanks. The nuclear submarines are not a done deal. They've got to get through US Congress. So I think we've got to keep that in mind, that that this is not necessarily going to happen. I think despite the negative comments that have been made about the state of our democracy, all true, we do have a democracy where we can visit our parliamentarians, and our parliamentarians, if we're a constituent of them, they need our vote and they will listen to their constituents. They might not listen to other people so much. So, and how many people we got here? About 100 or so on this call. So, you know, that could be 100 visits to a local parliamentarian, especially if they're a Labor person or one of the independents. And those visits really, really count for a lot. So I'd suggest go and see them, set out your arguments against AUKUS. And a key one, I think, is why in God's name are we spending $368 billion on these ridiculous things when much, much smaller amounts have to struggle to get through Parliament? Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. Really, really good point, good argument. Is that our final question from the floor?
So much wisdom on this panel. The third, I guess, chunk of questions that I'll try and summarize are about the revolving door issue. It came up a few times. Leonard is keen to hear what can we do to close the revolving door and solve that issue. And Ben wants to know, Michelle, particularly about your research, how you create the database, how you get the data.
Thanks, Isab. So I might ask Michelle and Mark to weigh in on this one. Mark, you can maybe talk to our democracy's policy on this, and Michelle, we'll start with you to talk about, that last question about how you're going to actually do the research and do the database.
Yes, well, I've already started. So I'm going to go through systematically now. For years, I've been keeping links, so I have quite a lot. I already have somebody, Evan Predovic from Political Gadgets, we've created the database, the architecture, and that's already been set up. And so I'm already starting the data entry. It's going to go from year 2000 to now, and focus mostly on the top 15 defence contracted arms related ones in Australia, with a couple of extras added on, and then down through certain senior positions, so quite systematically. As well as that, instead of just having a static database, which could be kind of boring, it'll have some from my work, little stories just showing what it means, how it works. This is how it happened, influenced a contract and that kind of thing. And we're having feeds from contract data as well. Another thing I'll say here, seeing as we've been, have I got time, or are we on the, I'll say it very quickly.
Yeah, if you can say it quickly.
We're talking about AUKUS. So I wanted, one of my visions was, and it's hopefully going to come about, it's happening with the UK, is that I mentioned earlier that there are 2 good databases in US and UK. I've already had approval and talked to the UK people we're going to share our feeds. And I want to, once that's set up and it's looking good, I want to do the same with the USA. So we'll have an AUKUS type revolving door database. So it'll be massively interesting to see the movement in the big arms companies amongst the AUKUS nations. So that's what's happening there.
That's great, Michelle. Thanks. And Mark?
Look, from our democracy movement, the position is that ministers, their senior staff and senior public servants should not be able to lobby or advise on lobbying in matters that relate to their portfolios for 3 years. So that would be a legislative ban rather than the current system, which is largely unenforceable code, where we see it sort of made a mockery of regularly. So this is a requirement of the UN Convention Against Corruption that such laws be in place, and lots of other countries already have them.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And we should also mention that having a strong lobbyist register is really important, where you kind of broaden the definition of lobbying that captures more interactions, so that we can actually start to track all those meetings and relationships that those people that are now in new cushy jobs are using to their advantage. Thanks so much, everyone, and for all of your questions. I'm sorry that we haven't got to more of them. We will be sending out some information that might answer some of the questions that you've been having, and I'll check in with Isabella after the session to see what we can do in our follow-up as well. But Mark, I'm going to throw to you for our last question to the panel.
So last question here is, our democratic processes don't always feel like an even playing field when you're up against big money of industry. This is a question for everyone. How and when have you seen community and civil society levelling the playing field and taking back their democracy for public interest?
We'll start with you, Sue.
Okay, thanks. Just 2 or 3 points. Tell me if I'm talking for too long. In relation to the weapons companies in schools, which is a big problem, there's actually been some success there. MAPW has reached out to the education ministers in all the states and territories, asking them to ensure that weapons companies are excluded from sponsorships with schools, along with gambling, alcohol, and other industries. And 3 of the state governments, Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland, have actually strengthened their policy so that schools can't have sponsorships with weapons companies. So that's really encouraging. One other example, 2 or 3 years or so ago, the children's charity Smith family were receiving funding from BAE Systems, which was pretty terrible, given that BAE Systems were bombing Yemen at the time, and Smith family are a children's charity. So we had some exchange of letters between us and them, which basically did no good. But we said to them, well, okay, this issue needs to be publicised. And Paul Daly did an article in The Guardian the following day. And within 24 hours, that sponsorship that receipt of funds had ceased, that financial arrangement. So the message there is that companies and charities care about their reputations. They care a lot. That's about all they have to go on. So anything that can be done to damage a relationship which shouldn't be there in the first place is good. I could say more, but I think I've said too much.
Those are great examples, Sue. Thank you so much. We probably have time for one more panelist. Scott, you've come off mute.
Yeah, well, this is one of my favorite questions, and I'm really glad that you threw it, because it's a great note to end on, because we are up against tough stuff. It's hard. But kind of community organising and building power collectively across different social movements are one of the reasons why there's no longer an 8X arms fair in Australia. Just rat bags stop that from happening. The reason that we're still talking about a national nuclear waste dump, which does not exist in this country on Aboriginal land, is because people for decades have fought and stopped that. It's tiring work and it extracts a big cost from people, but it's been successful. There's no uranium mine at Jabiluka or anywhere in Kakadu at the moment. We're having this conversation against the backdrop of a newly stood up national ICAC. People on this call made that happen. There's no nuclear power station in Jervis Bay, where I drove past today, because people stopped it from happening. So anything we set our minds to, we can do. One last thing, because I didn't get to do it before, and I know this is cheeky, but I'm going to, is a book plug. I've just thrown, like, on the broadest context of this issue of the arms industry, politics, our relationship with the US AUKUS, this gorgeous little book, you'll be able to read it in a couple of hours, by Clinton Fernandez, called Sub-Imperial Power, just sets out the playing field that we're on. There you go, flick in all caps, the best book you could read. If you want to know the lie of the land, plain English, a bit of history, a bit of context, and a bit of right now, you can't do better than that as a read. It's terrifying, but I found it profoundly optimistic. We still live in the kind of country where you can publish that, and we can share this knowledge around. Anyway, that's my book club recommendation.
Thanks, Scott. So much in that, and very inspiring, and a book club recommendation as well. Thank you. That was a good note to end on. And, thank you so much to the panel. It's been both enlightening and shocking to hear some of the pervasive, greedy tactics of the arms industry. I won't go into too much summarising it, but I just wanted to thank the whole panel for sharing so generously with us, and to thank all of you for your questions. I'm going to get to what we do from now. But before I do that, I'd love us to take a photo. So if everyone can turn their video on, I'd really appreciate it. And even though you're all on mute, on the count of 3, we're going to all say democracy. So 1, 2, 3, democracy. And then peace on 3. 1, 2, 3, peace. Great. Oh yeah, we can do our peace symbol. Already, 1, 2, 3. Everyone, peace fingers. Yeah, that's great. Ophelia, give me a thumbs up when we've got the photo. Yeah, very good. All right. So, what can we do about ratcheting down the influence of the arms industry on our democracy? Firstly, I would love all of you to endorse the framework for a fair democracy. So Mark went into this in some detail tonight. There's a lot more detail that we can send you. So I'm not going to repeat it, but if you agree that these reforms are needed, that we need to level the playing field and stop that cash for access, please sign on. We encourage you that if you're representing an organisation to join the campaign as an endorsing partner. And if you're an individual, to sign on as an individual. So we're going to drop some links in the chat. Secondly, get trained on how to have an effective meeting with your MP. You know, Sue talked about this tonight, about how important it is to go and meet with your decision maker. We do live in a democracy. It's really important that we are taking back our democracy from those that would seek to exert undue influence on it. It's really easy to give up, but we need to not lose faith and actually engage in it. So we need to get more savvy, more skilled, and more organized. We need to engage. And that begins with our own representatives. So on July 19th, we're holding a training sharing expertise from decades of government relations. And we would love to share that with you and hear from you about your experiences as well. So we hope that you'll all be there. Third, we need to reclaim remembrance, like what Sue was mentioning, by calling on the Australian War Memorial to get those who profit from war out of our war commemoration. So the Medical Association for the Prevention of War are running a campaign to do that deep, important work of shifting the narrative about Australia's relationship with war in our country. One way they're doing that is the Reclaim Remembrance campaign. And we're asking you to send a personal message to the memorial via Reclaim Remembrance website. And last but certainly not least, we are launching the Fair Play Bill in Canberra on the 1st of August, so 3 weeks away. And we would love you to be there with us, either in spirit or in person. You know, as representatives of community voices, we've written a bill that seeks to change the rules of how industry relates to our elected representatives. We'll be holding a press conference, we're meeting with decision makers, and we're doing a massive big stunt on the lawns to demonstrate the community's will that our democracy should work for us and not just the powerful few. So we really hope that you'll join us either in person or online, and we're going to share some links in the chat about that. So remember at the start of the night, I asked what was one word that you would use to describe the relationship that Australia has with war. Now, vision is a powerful thing. As we get towards the end of the night, I want you to share one word in the chat which describes your vision for an Australia that is free from the capture of the arms industry. What might that Australia look like? I'm just going to bring my chat up to make sure I can have a look. What are people saying in the chat? Independent. Half intelligent, that's 2 words. What else are people saying? At choice, liberated, sovereignty, harmony. Internationalist, community, optimistic, free, safe, just, thriving. Yeah, that is the kind of Australia that I want to live in, and I want it to be free from the undue influence of the arms industry, as I'm sure all of you do. Thank you very much to all of our panelists, and thank you to co-hosting organisations, and also to all of you for joining us tonight.